She had been soaking her skin in olive oil and myrrh for 11 months. Every morning before dawn, before the village stirred, before the roosters of Nazareth shattered the silence, a young woman barely 15 years old sat in the corner of her father's house and worked fragrant oil into her hands, her arms, the skin of her neck, until the scent of myrrh became indistinguishable from the scent of her own body. She was becoming someone new. And in a house barely 200 steps away, a young man was building her a room. This is what love looked like in the world Jesus grew up in. Not a feeling whispered in private, not a choice made in isolation. Love was a construction project. Love was a legal negotiation. Love was a year-long transformation of two families, two households, two futures being slowly, deliberately, irreversibly fused into one. And every single element of it, every detail, every ritual, every word spoken over the cup of wine, carried inside it a meaning so enormous that when God himself wanted to explain what he was doing with the entire human race, he reached for this. He reached for a wedding. The process began not with romance, but with a knock on a door. The father of the groom approached the father of the bride for a meeting called Shidduchin, the betrothal negotiation. This was not a conversation about feelings. This was a transaction of the most solemn kind, a legally binding contract in which a mohar, a bride price, was agreed upon. Deuteronomy set the standard at 50 shekels of silver for a virgin bride. To put that in terms that land, 50 shekels represented roughly 200 days of labor, a working man's wages for the better part of a year. That is what a daughter was worth. That is what the groom's family laid on the table before a single vow was spoken. The bride was not being purchased. She was being honored. The cost declared publicly in front of witnesses that this woman had extraordinary value and that the family taking her was willing to bear the weight of that value in silver. And then came the moment that changed everything. The betrothal ceremony itself, Erusin, also called Kiddushin. That second word comes from the Hebrew root kudish, and it means to sanctify, to set apart. The same root used for the Holy of Holies, the same root used for the Sabbath, the same root used for God himself. When a man betrothed a woman in first-century Israel, the language the culture used was not the language of romance, it was the language of holiness. She was being set apart, consecrated, made sacred to one man the way sacred space was made sacred to God. Here is what most people miss. After this ceremony, the couple was legally married, fully, bindingly, legally married. But they did not go home together. They did not touch. They did not share a roof. The groom returned to his father's house, and the bride remained in hers, and they would live apart for up to an entire year. If something went wrong during that year, if the betrothal needed to be dissolved, it required a formal divorce document, a get, the same legal instrument used to end a consummated marriage. This is not a footnote. This is the entire context for one of the most misunderstood moments in the New Testament. When Matthew tells us that Joseph, discovering Mary was pregnant, planned to divorce her quietly, modern readers stumble. Divorce? They were not even married yet, were they? They were. Completely. That is how binding Erusin was. Joseph needed a legal divorce to walk away from a woman he had never held. The groom went home to build. The room he constructed was called a cheder, a bridal chamber, and it was not a separate house. It was an addition to his father's existing dwelling. The archaeology is vivid on this point. Excavations at Kephar Nahum, the village we call Capernaum, the village where Jesus made his home, reveal clusters of basalt stone rooms built around shared courtyards. New rooms added organically as sons married and brought their brides into the family compound. The stones are black, volcanic, rough cut from the local bedrock. The roofs were wooden beams covered in packed mud and reeds. A typical bridal chamber measured roughly 2.5 meters by 3, barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a storage niche carved into the wall. It was small, it was humble, and a young man spent months making it ready, because this room was the physical proof of his promise. When it was finished, his bride would enter it and their life would begin. Now listen to what Jesus says to his disciples on the last night of his life. Listen with first-century ears. "In my Father's house are many rooms. I am going to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am you may be also." Every person at that table heard wedding language, every one of them. Jesus was not speaking in abstract metaphors about heaven. He was using the exact vocabulary of a groom speaking to his bride during the betrothal year. "I'm going to my Father's house. I'm building your room. I'm coming back for you. And when I come, I will carry you home." While the groom built, the bride was being transformed. Her preparation was not casual. It was prescribed, intensive, and deeply physical. The Mishnah specifies that a betrothed woman was entitled to cosmetics and perfumed oils from the moment of her betrothal onward. Daily applications of olive oil mixed with myrrh softened the skin. Baths infused with frankincense and nard purified and scented the body. Henna was worked into intricate patterns on hands and feet, the reddish dye sinking into the skin over hours. Song of Solomon catalogues the fragrances like a love poem written in scent: nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, frankincense and myrrh and aloes. These were not decorative luxuries. They were the bride becoming ready. Her body itself was being prepared for the moment of union, layer by layer, day by day, for months. Some of these perfumes were staggeringly expensive. The balsam groves of Ein Gedi, near the Dead Sea, produced what Pliny the Elder called the most precious perfume in the ancient world. Pure nard, spikenard, imported along trade routes from the Himalayas, cost 300 denarii for a single alabaster flask. That is nearly a full year of wages for one container of perfume. And yet it was used. It was poured out. Song of Solomon references henna blossoms from the vineyards of Ein Gedi, as though the poet cannot separate the beloved from the fragrance of that place. The bride carried the cost of devotion in her very skin, and then the waiting. No one told the bride when her groom would come. This is the detail that makes the entire system pulse with theological meaning. The groom's father, and the groom's father alone, determined when the bridal chamber was ready. When the father was satisfied that his son's work was complete, he released the son to go and fetch his bride. But the bride did not know the day. She did not know the hour. She only knew it would be night, because the procession always came at night, and she had to be ready. Jesus stands on the Mount of Olives, days before his death, and his disciples ask him when the end will come. His answer: "No one knows the day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, not even the Son, but only the Father." Scholars have debated this verse for centuries. How can the Son not know? But a first-century Jewish listener would not have been puzzled at all. They would have recognized the phrase instantly. It is what every groom said when someone asked when the wedding would happen. "I do not know. Only my Father knows." Jesus was not making a theological statement about the limits of divine knowledge. He was telling his bride, his people, that the wedding was coming, that he was the groom, that the Father would decide, and that they must be ready. The night arrived without warning. The groom gathered his shoshbinim, his groomsmen, his friends, his companions, and they lit their lamps and torches and set out through the darkened village streets. The procession was loud, deliberately loud. Shouts went up as they moved. "The bridegroom is coming!" The sound carried through the narrow stone corridors between the basalt houses, echoing off walls still warm from the day's sun. And in her father's house, the bride heard it, the cry she had been waiting months to hear. Picture this: a village in the Galilee, no streetlights, no electricity. The darkness is total, broken only by the stars and the oil lamps burning in windows. And then sound, voices, the clatter of sandals on stone, the glow of torches rounding a corner, the flames reflected in the polished basalt walls, shadows leaping and dancing ahead of the procession. The whole village wakes. Children press their faces against doorframes, women lean from rooftops, and the cry goes up again and again. The bridegroom is coming, come out to meet him. This is the parable of the 10 virgins, and it is not a parable at all. It is a description of something that happened in every village, in every generation, for centuries. 10 bridesmaids waited with their oil lamps for the groom's midnight arrival. 5 had brought extra oil, 5 had not. And when the procession finally came, later than expected as it always was, because only the Father knew the hour, the 5 without oil found their lamps sputtering out in the darkness. They ran to buy more, and when they returned, the door was shut. That detail is not dramatic embellishment, it is legal reality. Once the groom entered the bride's house and the wedding party processed back to his father's house, the door was sealed. The celebration was now a closed event. Those inside were inside, those outside were outside, and no amount of knocking would change it. The small clay lamps they carried, archaeologists have recovered hundreds of them from Galilean sites. They are called Herodian-type oil lamps, round-bodied, with a spatulate nozzle, mass-produced from molds, small enough to hold in one hand. They burned olive oil through a single flax wick, producing a flame visible for maybe 50 meters in absolute darkness. The same olive oil pressed from trees that still stand in the Galilee today, some of them estimated at nearly 2,000 years old, based on carbon dating of their root systems. The oil that lit the way for the bridegroom is still being produced from the same ancient roots. I want you to feel the weight of that. The trees are still there. The oil still flows. The lamps have been dug from the soil and placed in museum cases, and you can see the soot marks on the nozzles where the flame burned 2,000 years ago, lighting the way for a groom who was walking through the darkness to claim the woman he loved. When the groom arrived, the procession was called Niswin, from the Hebrew word nasa, meaning to carry, to lift up. The groom literally carried his bride, or at minimum, lifted her and bore her symbolically from her father's house to his. She crossed a threshold. She left one family and entered another, and she did it veiled. The bridal veil was so central to Jewish wedding culture that the Hebrew word for bride itself, kala, may derive from a root meaning to cover or to veil. The veil was heavy, opaque, total. It did not merely obscure the bride's features. It concealed her identity entirely. Rebecca veiled herself the moment she first saw Isaac approaching across the field, and the text treats this as the natural, expected act of a woman meeting her future husband. Generations later, the veil's concealing power enabled one of the most dramatic deceptions in Scripture. When Laban substituted Leah for Rachel on Jacob's wedding night, it worked because the groom could not see his bride's face until the marriage was consummated. The friend of the bridegroom, the shoshbin, had a role so specific, so defined, that it carried legal standing. He was the witness, the intermediary, the organizer of the torch procession. And on the wedding night, he stood outside the sealed door of the bridal chamber and listened. He listened for the groom's voice, the shout of joy that confirmed the marriage had been consummated. And when he heard it, he turned to the waiting guests and announced the good news. John the Baptist, standing at the Jordan River, watching his own followers leave him to follow Jesus, says this: "The friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. This joy of mine is now complete." He is not reaching for a clever metaphor. He is identifying his exact role in the divine wedding. I am the shoshbin. I am the friend who stands outside the door. I arranged the procession, I lit the lamps, and now I hear the groom's voice, and my work is finished. The joy is his. I decrease, he increases. The depth of what John understood in that moment could break your heart if you let it. The feast itself lasted 7 days, 7 full days, not an afternoon reception with a dinner and a dance. A week. The pattern was ancient. Genesis records that when Jacob married Leah, Laban told him to fulfill her week, establishing the 7-day wedding feast as a binding custom nearly 2,000 years before Jesus was born. And in the 1st century, it was still observed at every social level. Josephus describes Herod the Great's wedding to Mariamne as a multi-day feast of extraordinary lavishness, with wine imported from Italy and Greece served alongside local vintages from the Golan Heights and the hills of Hebron. But a peasant wedding in a Galilean village kept the same 7-day structure. The feast was the feast, whether the wine was imported or local. And the feast was enormous. Imagine the tables. Roasted lamb, the centerpiece, prepared whole over wood coals. Flatbread torn from rounds, baked in a taboon clay oven. The bread still warm, still fragrant with the char of the fire. Lentil stews thick with cumin and coriander. Dried figs pressed into dense cakes. Dates, pomegranates split open, their seeds glistening like jewels. Olives cured in salt brine until they were dark and soft. Fresh goat cheese, white and crumbling. Honey poured over everything, and wine, rivers of wine flowing for 7 days, the financial responsibility of the groom's family alone. The music never stopped. The Hallel, a double-piped flute, reedy and insistent, wove through the celebration like a thread. The Toph, a hand drum, a tambourine, was played predominantly by women, their rhythms driving the dancing. The Kinnah, a lyre with 10 strings, the instrument of David, added melody above the percussion. The Mishnah tells us that even the poorest man in Israel was required to hire at least 2 flute players for his wife's funeral. Wedding music would have been far more elaborate. Jesus himself referenced it. "We played the flute for you, and you did not dance." He had watched these celebrations. He had heard this music. He had grown up inside this world. The dancing was segregated. Men with men, women with women, often in circles that spun faster as the music intensified. The Talmud preserves a remarkable image. The great sage Rav Shmuel Bar Rav Yitzhak juggling 3 myrtle branches while dancing before the bride. Other rabbis thought it was beneath his dignity, but when he died, a pillar of fire appeared, and the tradition interpreted it as heaven's approval. Joy at a wedding was not frivolous, it was sacred. The school of Hillel ruled that every bride, regardless of her appearance, must be praised as beautiful and graceful. Celebration was a commandment. Tell me in the comments, when you hear these details, does it change the way you see the stories Jesus told? Does the wedding at Cana feel different now? Does the parable of the virgins land with new weight? I want to know what struck you most, because now we come to Cana. It was the 3rd day. John's Gospel specifies this with the precision of a witness who was there. The Mishnah records that virgins were typically married on Wednesday, the 4th day of the Jewish week, because the local court sat on Thursday, allowing a groom to file a complaint about his bride's virginity the very next morning if necessary. The system was not romantic. It was legal, practical, embedded in a network of social obligations and financial guarantees. The ketubah, the marriage contract, specified the husband's obligations in silver. 200 zuz for a virgin bride. 200 denarii, 200 days of a working man's wages, set aside as the wife's security in case of divorce or her husband's death. This was not a ceremony. It was an economic restructuring of 2 families, witnessed, signed, and enforceable in court. And at one particular wedding in a small village on a limestone ridge overlooking the Beit Netofa Valley in Lower Galilee, the wine ran out. To a modern listener, this sounds like an inconvenience, an embarrassment at worst. To a 1st century Jewish family, it was a catastrophe. The concept of busha, social shame, carried consequences that were not merely emotional, but legal. The groom's family bore full financial responsibility for the feast. Running out of wine before the 7 days were complete was a breach of hospitality so severe that the bride's family could sue. Reputations built over generations could be destroyed in a single evening. Marriages could begin under a cloud of humiliation that would follow the family for years. Mary turns to Jesus. They have no wine. 3 words in English, in the original Greek, 4 words that contain a universe of trust. She does not tell him what to do. She does not ask for a miracle. She states the need and leaves it in his hands. And something in her voice, in her certainty, in the decades she had spent carrying the secret of who this man truly was, something in that pushed him to act before what he called his hour had come. 6 stone jars stood nearby. John tells us they were there for Jewish ceremonial washing, the constant purification rituals that governed daily life. He specifies their material, stone, not clay. This matters enormously. The Mishnah explains that stone vessels, unlike clay pottery, could not become ritually unclean. Clay that touched impurity had to be smashed and discarded. Stone was permanent. Stone was pure. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of these large stone vessels in Jerusalem's Jewish quarter, confirming their widespread use. Jesus chose vessels of permanent purity to hold the new wine. The water of ritual cleansing became the wine of celebration. The containers that held the Old Covenant's demand for purity now held the New Covenant's gift of joy. Each jar held 2 or 3 meters, a Greek unit of roughly 40 liters, 6 jars, between 480 and 720 liters of wine, between 600 and 960 modern bottles. This was not a modest gesture. This was an absurd, overwhelming, excessive flood of the finest wine anyone at that feast had ever tasted. The architriklinos, the master of the feast, the designated sober overseer, tasted it and was bewildered. Every host in history serves the good wine first and the inferior wine later, after the guests' palates are dulled. But you have kept the best wine until now. God saves the best for last. That is the signature. That is the pattern. That is the design written into the nature of redemption itself. The best wine comes at the end, when you thought the celebration was over, when you thought the joy had peaked and there was nothing left but diminishment. God saves the best for last. The Hebrew word simcha, joy, celebration, became virtually synonymous with the wedding feast itself. The prophets understood this. When Jeremiah wanted to describe the most devastating judgment God could bring upon a nation, he did not speak of armies or plagues. He said God would silence the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. The absence of wedding joy was the ultimate sign that God had withdrawn his presence. And when the book of Revelation reaches for the ultimate image of restoration, when all of history has been resolved, when every tear has been wiped away, when death itself has been swallowed, what image does it use? The marriage supper of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. From Genesis to Revelation, from the first wedding in Eden to the last wedding in eternity, the Jewish wedding is not an illustration God borrows occasionally. It is the master metaphor, the governing image for everything God is doing with the human race. Creation is the betrothal, the covenant is the contract, the cross is the bride price, the church age is the preparation year, the bride making herself ready, soaking her skin in the oil of the Spirit, becoming fragrant with holiness. And the second coming, the return of Christ, is the Nisuin, the nighttime procession, the shout in the darkness, the groom coming to carry his bride home to the room he has been preparing in his Father's house. No one knows the day or the hour, only the Father. You are in the betrothal year. Right now, today. The contract has been signed in blood, not in silver. The bride price has been paid, and it was not 50 shekels or 200 denarii. It was everything. It was a life. The groom has gone to his father's house, and he told you plainly what he is doing there. He is preparing your room. And he said, with the same words every Jewish groom spoke to his betrothed before walking away for those long months of separation, I will come again, I will receive you to myself. Where I am, you will be also. The lamps are lit, the oil is burning. Somewhere in the darkness the procession is forming. The Shoshbinim are gathering, the torches are being kindled. And soon, no one knows when, only the Father knows, soon the cry will go up, louder than anything the villages of Galilee ever heard, louder than anything this tired world has ever imagined. The bridegroom is coming. Come out to meet him. And on that night the veil will be removed. 1 Corinthians says it plainly, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. The Kala, the covered one, the veiled one, will finally see clearly, and the groom will see his bride, and the door will open to a feast that will not end in 7 days. It will not end at all. The olive trees in the Galilee are still producing oil. The ancient roots still push through the rocky soil, still bear fruit, still yield the golden liquid that once burned in the small clay lamps held high in the darkness by women who were waiting. The lamps have been found in the ground, soot-stained, cracked, emptied of their oil centuries ago. But the trees remain, the oil still flows, and the waiting, the long, sweet, aching waiting of the bride who knows her groom is coming but does not know the hour. That waiting is not over. It is yours. If this journey through the ancient world has opened something in you, if the wedding customs of Jesus' time have revealed a design you had never fully seen, then stay with us. There is so much more to uncover, so many rooms in the Father's house we have not yet entered. Subscribe and walk with us into the next story, because the best wine has not yet been poured, and it is coming.